Welcome and welcome to this week's City Circle 2015 Perspectives. We've got two speakers from very different backgrounds today, and what we're going to do is really look ahead at 2015 and what are some of the things coming up from the UK elections to global politics, and we're going to really discuss from politics to arts and personalities, and they're going to give an insight into what they see as the big issues coming up this year. So today we've got Bilal, who many of you will recognise.
In a good way.
Bilal is a regular at City Circle and he's chaired many events before, so you recognise Bilal. Bilal is a Labour parliamentary candidate from Chingford and Woodford Green. He will be fighting his local seat and taking on Secretary of State, Welfare and Pensions, Ian Duncan-Smith. Good luck for that.
Okay.
Bilal is one of a handful of Muslim candidates running in the upcoming general elections. A lawyer by profession, for over 10 years he has worked on social mobility programs focused on bridging the gap for many impoverished young people in the world. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Bilal.
Assalamu alaikum everybody. I thought I'd take my jacket off just as I got introduced, so that looks remarkably awkward. I'm Bilal Mahmood. I'm the parliamentary candidate for Chingford and Woodford Green. There are about three things you need to know about it. The first is it's in a very beautiful northeast London suburb town. Lots of driveways, lots of leafy green roads. The second thing about it you need to know is, despite that, and over the past 5 years, Chingford and Woodford Green, according to House of Commons Library statistics, is the second most impoverished constituency in the country, in that it has 43% of people living below the living wage. So that's essentially 1 in every 2 people that live in nice, leafy Woodford Green, Chingford, live below the living wage. And the reason being is because of two things. One, there's been a creeping change in demography. People have been priced out of central London and pushed further up. And the second one is there's this sense, and I'll talk about this a bit more, this idea of the working poor or the squeezed middle. For many years, people's incomes haven't been able to match their bills because there's a sense of pride in certain suburb areas. People don't like talking about it. And the third thing that it's important to know about my hometown seat is that my opponent is Ian Duncan-Smith, which in itself brings any number of jokes and or challenges with it. I was going to talk about, so I wrote the speech about a week and a half ago about this is what I think will happen in the election. This is a very national focused idea. Let's talk about that. But I think in light of recent events, I'm going to split my speech into two. I'm going to talk about where I think we are from an Islamic Muslim perspective on a global scale. And this one is something that I can't profess to be an absolute expert on, but as a person who is in frontline politics on a national scale, these are the observations I have, and these are the things I think are happening. And it's also not so much a call to arms, but 3 insights that I think will help me in the upcoming election, and maybe you can use them as well. And then I'll talk about the national election and kind of good old-fashioned dirty politics. So on the international scale, and the way I think about it is this almost global meta-melodrama of Islam in the West. And we've been going through this for almost 15 years, and it started with 9/11. Arguably, people say that it may have started with the satanic verses. I think a lot of people sometimes feel that and talk about that. But what's interesting is growing up during that period, you can see certain phases of what's happened. And I won't dwell on what has happened, perhaps look at what happened in 2014, and we've moved from whatever way you describe it, the war on terror, the growth of an east-west divide, a clash of civilizations. We've moved into a phase where it's far more about close-quarter debate. We've moved from terrorist organizations that are identifiable, committing organized acts against countries, to far more random acts of violence perpetrated by individuals, which are uncoordinated and often unsanctioned by wider organizations. And the distinction that we're seeing now is that Western media, for want of a better phrase, and Western zeitgeist has honed in on these individual situations. So Woolwich is a very good example, and indeed Paris, what happened last week, is also a very strong example of this. of Western media focusing in on these situations and now saying, right, this is now the norm, this is now what happens. And see, we now see random, uncoordinated attacks as part of a wider narrative about Islam as a faith and as Muslims. And what we then see from that, and so that kind of experiment of what's happening in the media and it's happening in the wider world, it's created essentially a hijacking from two perspectives. It's created a hijacking of, say, IS and the Muslims to say we're doing this to create a caliphate, and we're doing it from an extremist perspective to say we are doing this in the name of Islam, and therefore as Muslims it's incumbent upon us to be somewhat sympathetic. That's on the one hand. On the other side is a hijacking of going on that kind of neoliberal conservative streak to say, the only best way I can kind of describe it is they're now looking at us and saying, there's only so many times we can say that these are bad apples. We now need to start looking at the bushel of apples, which is Islam and Muslims. It's happened so many times, and this is what they're saying, we now need to look at the wider context of how does Islam fit in with us. And I'll talk a bit more on that in a minute. But what you see, and a really good example is if you haven't seen is in the US, if you see Bill Maher, you can YouTube him, he does a lot of this stuff. He's very funny actually. He's very funny, and actually most of the stuff I probably agree with him, but when it comes to Islam, he takes a very, very right-wing conservative view in his streets. And he's a very good example, because you saw him before 2001. He was pretty much, let's legalise cannabis, freedom for everybody, I'm pretty relaxed about stuff. But over the years, you've seen him kind of revolve around the idea of Islam to say, actually, it's not just the terrorists, it's the faith itself. It's what it exposes within society, and I, as a liberal, have a problem with that. So we've moved from that kind of classic, we are Muslims, these are terrorists, there is an underlying geopolitical argument going on, and we're separated from that, but we abhor the violence. We're now kind of caught in between these two. It's almost as if our faith and my faith, and me as a normal moderate Muslim, is being hijacked between two sets of people. People who are saying, I'm doing this in your name, and saying if you don't get up and condemn them, you're as bad as they are, which I always found fascinating. It's just, I have, frankly, with the people who passed away in Paris last week, I have more in common with them, probably, than I do the people who perpetrated it. I won't agree with every picture that they put up, I probably would have found it distasteful. I certainly don't think they should have been killed for it. But for some reason, it's now incumbent upon us, and now even Muslims in Britain sometimes feel the need to explain these people. We have nothing to do with them. They're beyond a contemplation about. And so we've moved on to a much more nuanced debate, which isn't so much you're with us or against us, or extreme apologists. It's now this kind of not in our name dynamic that we're going through, which is a much more, I think, positive step in the right direction, but it's also a harder one to sell. And it's a harder one to sell because we've had a litany of events like this happen in the past 5 or 10 years, which, in the context of the wider world, though atrocious as they are, the Woolwich example is a really good example of this, are things that happen within a context of this happening, and it's perpetrated by all races and all creeds. The difference is, and we all know this and we've seen this, is if you see a brown man commit an act of murder or any sort of violence, the words terrorists, the words extremists gravitate to it so much more naturally. A really good example is, I don't know if people were reading the news last week, in North Wales there was an attack in Tesco by a white man who called himself a white supremacist. He was walking, he's 24 years old, he was walking around with a machete in Tesco's, shouting white power. Every report that talked about this was unhinged man, madman, criminal. Let's for a moment suspend our disbelief and say, what if that person was brown? What if that person had an olive skin hue? What if that person had an Islamic sounding name? The headlines suddenly become very, very different. And I think there's something we're all starting to recognise, that there's two parts to this conversation now. It's like, now it's not in our name and we abhor it and it's not disconnected. More importantly, you, whatever the Western media, the current British zeitgeist, shouldn't feel the need to approach me to answer for these people. It's now about us taking that positive step to say, I am not responsible for them. It is not for me to connect myself to this extremist form of violence, and it's incorrect and wrong of you to make that connection for me. That's unjustified and it's unwarranted. And I think the way that I approach that is in three ways. And there's this first thing, which is the war of definitions. So by way of background, I'm a lawyer, so I love words more than I probably should, and I like kind of arguing over them. So when people talk about these things, you will hear it, and it started with forms of torture in Abu Ghraib and also in Guantanamo. People never use the word torture, people never use the word rape. People use the words and phrases extraordinary rendition, which makes it sound much more sedate and much more clinical. It's about us identifying those definitions where we see things as this person is a terrorist. Actually, no, this person is a criminal, clearly unhinged and based on his own agenda, and happens to look like one of us. I think that's the first thing we need to be very conscious of, and when we see that in social media and we see those opportunities, we need to raise that a lot more. The second one is denying these false choices. So it's you either support Charlie, the magazine, you're totally in favour of what they say, or you're a terrorist. I was like, how about no? How about I'm perfectly fine with the ideas of freedom of expression, but I think, like anybody else, there are limits to them, and I think it's unfair that we as Muslims don't get to say anything if we feel offended, whereas if Charlie Hebdo had released a provocative image of any other race or religion, there would be public outcry. And equally, that doesn't mean we in any way condone terrorism or what happened. And the final one is that kind of relentless reasoning. Especially over the past summer, we saw a lot of stuff happening in Gaza where, for the first time, I mean, as atrocious, as terrible as it was, and as atrocious as it was, there was a genuine sense that the mood nationally and across Western Europe was moving away from a default position of we must support Israel, to looking at things saying, this just doesn't feel right. That a democracy is performing these acts in the way that they are, and we need to readdress that. And that was as a result of, I think, one was frankly as a result of Israel's extraordinary violence over the past summer, more so than their usual stuff. But secondly was much more about focus on social media and a war of ideas and arguments. And what you saw over summer wasn't so much we're Muslims and we're enraged. It's we're Muslims and actually these are the 6 points why we think this is illegal, and these are the 3 points why we think this is unfair, and these are the 2 points of our solution. And you began to see that a lot more, and that was a much more reasoned debate than we have had for a long time. So that's kind of a somber international perspective, which is so much more observation than it is, I think, this, and I'm opening very welcome to people to make their suggestions and discussions on it, because I feel as qualified as anybody in the room. In terms of what I think we are going to see in this year in terms of national elections, the answer is I don't know. I wish I could give you more of a, I would love to say I think we'll see a Labour government. I think what it's safe to say is that this will be one of the closest run elections for a generation. And equally, nationally, it will be one of the most important elections for a generation. Because for the first time, and so the experiences that I have is about knocking on people's doors with a ridiculously large red rosette saying, hello, I'm from the Labour Party and I'd like you to vote for me. And then mostly they just shout at you. But when they don't shout at you, they actually have a conversation about where they think this country's going, what their concerns are, and what we need to do. And there's about 4 issues that keep coming up on the doorstep that I think will actually impact where we're going to be come June of this year. And I think there's this argument, the first thing that we've got is this real sense of apathy versus anger. I've never really seen so many people so upset and angry that they don't know who to vote for because they all feel the same. Apathy was, the 2005 election was a real apathy. We pretty much knew Tony Blair and New Labour were going to win, nobody really cared. And then there was anger, which was probably around the 80s where, like her or dislike of Margaret Thatcher really brought out people. And 87 was a good example of that. This is the first time in any set of election where you've got people who don't know how to vote and they're really annoyed about it. So the questions you ask are, who are you going to vote for? The answer is I don't know. So you make life easier. Would you prefer a Conservative government? I don't know. Would you prefer a Labour government? I don't know. Usually in those three questions, somebody gives a positive answer, either yes or no. And we're not seeing that, which is the strange thing. The second thing is the voter choice is much more diverse than we've had before. There is a genuine possibility, and I'm saying this with all complete seriousness, that Nigel Farage could be Deputy Prime Minister. As a result of voting patterns and the way things go, we could have a Conservative UKIP coalition. Now, I put myself out there as a member of the Labour Party, and I'm very proud to be that. I wouldn't vote for the Tories, but I understand them as a party, and I can understand people in the room who choose to vote Conservatives. Equally for the Lib Dems and for the Greens. But when it comes to UKIP, there is a sense of they are the anybody but party. They stand for this kind of reactionary populist movement to say, we're angry with everything that's going on, so we're stepping aside and being different. But the problem is what they're being in creating themselves as a different party is kind of almost the worst bits of all parties. And that's the real concerning point that I have for them. Also, door knocking, and I think this is probably prevalent to this group, two things. Fewer and fewer younger people are engaged with politics. And with the best intentions and the most door knocking we've got, that number's not changing, it's going in the wrong direction. Equally, the same is true for ethnic minorities as well. Now, if you think about who does society need to help out perhaps most, it's immigrant populations, and it's probably young people because they're around for the longest. And for both of them, they're feeling disenfranchised and disenchanted. So this year, I do feel is more of a make or break year for getting the young people more engaged with frontline direct politics. Things like Russell Brand, I put kind of Russell Brand in this big box and everything around him, from the Occupy movement to every sort of populist movement we have out there, is a short-term kind of, perhaps a plaster. But my worry is in terms of a long-term solution. Where is that actually going? What product is that going to produce? And it's one that we, for me, it's incumbent to make sure that, say, this is what the solutions that politics can give you, this is how to get more involved. And then finally, what I think will be the outcome, the answer is I don't know. But there are any number, I think there's a psophologist looked through it, there's probably 5 different potential answers of where we could be, all of which predominantly look like a coalition government. And I don't think the answer will be done on the May the 8th. I think it will take a couple of days. And I certainly think if you were to have this conversation again in 2016, we would have had a very drastic year in politics regardless of the result. I'm conscious that people would prefer questions, and I know I would definitely give Sarah some time, so I'm going to wrap up. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Bilal. Like I said, I'm sure there will be lots of questions, but we're just going to leave them for the end. Our next speaker is Sarah Hobb. Sarah is a senior project manager at Malasha and is involved with primarily the health and education projects. She previously interned at Malasha after leaving university in 2008 with a BA honours in Arabic and social anthropology. She specialised in medical anthropology, writing a dissertation on the multiple belief systems around illness and healthcare in Egypt. In previous roles, she has worked to develop the Edge of Arabia, an exhibition of contemporary art from Saudi Arabia, before going on to organise and manage educational youth expeditions between the UK and the Middle East. With that, I'll pass it on to Sarah, who I think has a few slides for us as well.
I do, and you'll have to bear with me because I start with reindeer. I thought I'd just do something completely different. I just want to say it's maslaha, and it's actually so it's commonly sort of translated as for the common good or in the public interest, but it's actually sort of an Islamic judicial term. Can you hear?
Yeah.
Is this working?
It's not on.
Oh, it might be in a minute.
Okay.
Can you hear me now? Sort of an Islamic judicial term, and there will be people in the room who know more about this than me, but basically it's a process within law that you can employ to instigate change. Really, that's sort of the meaning behind the word maslaha. So there's sort of 3 to 4 main sort of points that I would like to introduce, and then we can have a bit of a discussion. These are sort of based on my work experience and my sort of approach for looking forward, and certainly, as Bilal mentioned, sort of long-term solutions, or ideally sort of long-term solutions. And what I think will be sort of cropping up in 2015, or what we should or can be focusing on in 2015. The first being navigating identities. The second being the diversity of the UK and how this can be used, or how it can be sort of drawn on as a very, very practical tool to go beyond these very, very polarised debates that we seem to be having continually about lots and lots of things, to sort of go beyond and between and beyond them, and sort of related to that still, how we really should be involving communities in their own futures, and then sort of as a last point, and just throwing it out there, sort of the decentralisation or devolving power regionally, as something that I think will crop up as partly as a result of the Scottish referendum. So navigating identities, or the navigation of identities. I wanted to begin in Scotland with this picture of reindeer. In my spare time, this is what I do. I herd reindeer. It's probably as different as I could get from inner city East London, working with Muslim communities, which is also my passion. I want to share this for several reasons. It's a good sort of illustration of the diversity of the UK, in many ways, sort of landscape, livelihoods, all sorts of things. But secondly, these are very definitely Scottish reindeer. And sort of to explain that, so they have sort of their own distinct identity. They're native to Scotland, reindeer. They were reintroduced by a Swedish Sami man in the 1950s. But everything sort of about the herd's survival in Scotland has had to be learnt from scratch. Everything's sort of been trial and error, specific to this context. So, for example, the way to call them down off the mountains is just a very Scottish version of a Sami, of a traditional Sami. So it's a constant navigation between old and new. And the supplementary food that they eat is dark grains, which is left over from the whisky distilling industry. So they're very differently Scottish reindeer with their own distinct identity. But that's had to be sort of developed over a series of decades. To completely change the view, this is a group of young men we're working with at Maslaha at the moment in East London. This image is their response to how they felt that they were being portrayed in the media as young Muslim men, as ex-offenders, and they wanted to show a very, very different view. It was based on this Enlightenment painting by Joseph Wright, which looks at all sorts of themes, sort of light and dark, redemption, hope. It was also one of the first paintings to really show that authority came from science rather than God. And we had a very, very interesting trip to the National Gallery where the young lads decided that this was the painting that they wished to recreate, but in their own way. So, navigating identities. Sort of moving on as a development to the second point, so the diversity within the UK and how this can be drawn on as a practical tool to go beyond these polarised debates. So whether that's also then, whether it's blasphemy versus freedom of speech, whatever it is current, how we can draw on that. So in terms of cultural diversity, this is how that can be used as a practical tool. This is a project, again, a Maslaha project around mental health, working with Muslim communities, and particularly the Somali, Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities. It's sort of, we wanted to go beyond, or we wanted to basically create a language collectively around depression, which didn't previously exist, and to create a space which didn't previously exist. And we do this through, drawing on film, drawing on sort of local expertise, which wouldn't usually be accessible or necessarily valued at a higher level. So everyday voices, everyday expertise, drawing on sort of cultural references, faith advice, music, design, everything to sort of to shape a language or space in which this is possible and feasible. This lady actually, she's wonderful. She's based not too far away from here in West London. She volunteered to appear in this film, and she's so sort of as an aside, she's had a fantastic response from the local community as a result of being in this film. And so what we found now is that this film or this resource is being used with both patients and practitioners in lots of different contexts around the country. So it's used in community organisations, it's used with NHS, amongst NHS trusts and CCGs. It's also being used as a training tool internationally as well. The Queensland government in Australia are using it. So it's resources that we have here available to us ourselves within our communities that we can sort of collectively build on to enrich our own understanding, but then to address quite severe social needs as well. As a second point to this is that we're currently working with King's College to develop quite an immersive workshop that it'll explore lots of different aspects of, I guess, the diversity of the UK, and if you're, and how to run that in medical practice, and how to use that as a tool or as a resource. In terms of diversity of opinion, again, this was a project that we produced because we were hearing again and again the two poles of, oh, if you're Muslim, you can't be a feminist, and at the other pole, Western feminism isn't relevant to me, it's not mine. And there seemed to be no other sort of perspectives or insight other than those 2 points. So we wanted to just show a range of perspectives, past and present, as well as sort of grassroots to policy. So sort of those 4 aspects of the compass, really. You probably see a few familiar faces on here. So we've done various things in this resource, but these are a set of short videos. And again, it's to broaden and deepen understanding of the issue rather than placing it in polarised terms. This is very close to where I live in East London. This is sort of building on the previous point as well, and I can't believe I still have to say this in 2015, but just the absolute crucial importance of involving communities in their own futures. And to a great extent, I still can't believe it doesn't happen across the board, or still too often. Sort of outsiders are parachuted in to do something to, or not work with local communities they are purported to be supporting. And I just wanted to give 2 short examples from Tower Hamlets. The first being, when we were working with these young men in East London, one of their colleagues works for HSBC in Canary Wharf, and their employees came out to do some good in the community by clearing up Mile End Park. They said lots of derogatory things while they were clearing up the park about the area, but it was more the point that the community hadn't been sort of asked or involved at all in what possibly was the best use of HSBC's time, effort, energy, resources, which is a real shame, because we could think of 10 organisations that could have really benefited from all of that. And secondly, I can't remember my second example. It's also the example of the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow, when they were sort of clearing the new area or flattening the existing houses and community centre. When they rebuilt, there was no thought given to, or very little thought given to the resources that had been lost, i.e. the community centre. There was no thought given to the future social fabric, certainly, of that area. And the local community had to campaign sort of full-time for the building of another community centre. And so the 4th point, and again potentially leading on from that, which is another reason I mentioned the reindeer, in Scotland with with the referendum in Scotland, I just and various things, you know, Yorkshire now campaigning to be a country. I think it's just going to be very interesting over the next year. How people feel in terms of navigating identities, in terms of decentralising power, particularly, you know, if there is an urban-rural divide, and if that, you know, needs to be devolved much more out of London. I think those discussions and those debates are definitely going to be happening in earnest, really, over the next year. But really, I mean, my sort of main point is that I think we have sort of richness in the UK that we can draw on at all levels for practice, for sort of social needs, for you know, in how and what we do to respond to things like Charlie Hebdo. That I mean, I'm quite, I don't know, optimistic. I don't know. I feel like there's a lot we can draw on. So that's what I'd really like to see much more of in the coming year.
Thank you, Sarah and Will. Before we open it up for Q&A to the audience, I thought I'd just mention what we have coming up for City Circle in 2015. Next week we have an event called Rethinking Jihad and Extremism, and it's something that Bilal touched upon. It's obviously quite a big issue in the news, and it will be an analysis on the number of people that are leaving to go to Iraq and Syria, for example, the rise of IS, and an analysis into the war on terror. So that's coming up next Friday. It's at a different venue, so it's ticket booking. The week after we have an event on Islamophobia, which is back here at this venue, and again that's a free event. A couple of the other events that we have coming up during the year, we have a comedy event in March, so going away from some of the serious issues and maybe using comedy to tackle some of those issues, and that will be at the Comedy Store in Leicester Square in March. Some of you might have heard there's a play at the National Arts Theatre called Dara, and towards the end of March we're going to do an event on that play as well here at City Circle.
It's very good. If you haven't seen it, you should go watch it. It's actually really good. But I have any experience.
Have you been to see it?
Yes, I have. It's excellent. I have limited abilities to say I'm an expert in theatre, but I watched it. You know, we really enjoyed it, and it was very thought-provoking. So, if you have a chance, you should go out and watch it. I have no interest in it. I'm not like I haven't got shares in the theatre company or anything. I just genuinely think it's a good show to go and watch.
Just two more things. We have an event on diversity and racism in sport, and finally, this will something that will interest Bilal. We have a Get Out and Vote campaign in April. So we're working with an organisation called MEND, we used to be called I Engage, and you talked about looking at issues that affect the Muslim community, and what MEND have done is they've researched a number of issues. So these are the 7 issues that impact the Muslim community, and what is the position of each of the different parties on those 7 issues, and they will do a presentation on those 7 issues, and then leave it up to you to decide what is important for you, and you make a decision on who you decide to vote for. So those are some of the things coming up later on in the year, and then throughout the year we've obviously got our projects running. We've got our Saturday schools, one in West London, one in Harrow. We've got the Homeless Project on Sundays, and we're launching a new legal advice clinic, hopefully at the end of February. So if there are any lawyers in here, apart from Bilal, who would like to get involved, please get in touch with us afterwards. So with that, I am now going to open it up for Q&A, and would anyone like to kick us off? And if not, I will kick us off with a question that I don't think I ever thought I would ask at City Circle. But how did you get into herding reindeers?
Yeah, I'm not really sure how to. I just did. I'm a country girl anyway, and I relax by working physically. I guess I relax by not just working with my brain, but working with the whole of me. And so I was, wondering if there were any. I'd lived in Norway. I have to preface that I had lived in Norway, and so I was wondering if there were any reindeer in the UK that, and there were. So I just sent them an email. And
You sent the reindeer an email, or you
I
sent
Are there many people that do?
no,
Reindeer.
very few, very, very few.
Question to Bilal. You touched on UKIP, which is kind of the vote that is for all those who are disappointed in the mainstream parties. And yet, ironically, I think it almost seems like, although they're known to be, or at least they have a reputation of being racist, if anything, there is something appealing about them, at least in that they are opposed to foreign intervention. And of course, your party and the Conservative Party have been heavily involved in foreign interventions that have fueled, if anything, the sentiment of alienation for Muslims, and also encouraged at times Muslims to travel to Syria, for instance. So how do you sort of navigate that?
I bet every penny I have in my house and my mortgage, and probably my parents' mortgage, that if you ever gave Nigel Farage any sort of power, he would be a gung-ho, gung-ho diplomat and would be going and charging anywhere because he thinks it's right. You only need... The thing that I find most frustrating about that party is, one is they're very good at perpetuating the myth that all politics are liars. You only need to see his interview with Sean Hannity on Fox News 3 days ago to see that he talks about Islam and Muslims as the fifth column, and he's very relaxed about the idea of intervening not based on ideas or on country's protection, but on the fact that other people are Muslim. You only have to see what he was when he starts talking about what happened in France and starts referring to us in a very unwholesome and unnerving way. You then take a side step and say, that's just the front man. You look at it as a kind of a hotbed of varieties of people who are angry and populist. I would actually also probably contest that they're not the only anti-party out there. They're not the only party there that people are voting for because they feel the mainstream politics is not for them. I think the Green Party is actually swelling through the ranks because they see that as a genuine alternative option. There's also parties such as Class War and the NHA.
Sorry, but my point, I appreciate that...
and also to the point of the Labour Conservative point, and I think it's difficult, and I think nobody ever feels comfortable there. We have a choice to say, right, I can disengage and say, right, they're the same, they did actions that we're regretful of. Did I quit the party during the mini-person march for Iraq? Yes, I know lots of Muslims who did for the Labour Party, and we were heartbroken. And I think it's fair to say I joined the party because of Tony Blair, and I also quit the party because of Tony Blair. He was pivotal in getting a generation of people involved in it, but also pushing them away. But things have been happening since he's left, and actually well before he had left, that shows if we aren't involved in this process in a mainstream way, people like UKIP, who have some very nasty subtext to their messages, will be coming to the front, will be coming to the fore. Conversations that we could never imagine to be on front page news 5 years ago are starting to happen. People are now asking, well, why are Muslims so afraid to condemn people who don't like cartoonists? Why don't you come out more and apologise? And that's starting to happen. And I'm normally not a doomsayer, I'm normally the funny guy. But this time I'm not. And actually I think I need to be in this game to be able to say, actually, no, there's a line and we draw it. I totally appreciate that both parties and the Labour Party have done things in their past that are regrettable. And no one feels that more than I do. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to sit by and say, right, I'm allowing this to progress, because there is a vacuum around me of saying they betrayed us for a period of time before. It's not the nicest answer in the world, but it's an honest answer. Killed the mood as well.
Another question for Bilal. I work in an A&E department.
Yeah.
You've probably heard it all in the news recently that it's horrendously busy.
Yeah.
One of the reasons for it being so busy is that the Labour government decided that the general practitioners didn't have to do any on-call out of hours, and gave them an extremely good offer, at which they bit the hands off the government. And what we're now finding is that so many patients come into the emergency department simply because there's no out-of-hours GP service. And actually it has a knock-on effect on patient care. So I was just wondering what your position or the Labour Party's position would be in trying to alleviate those problems. And I've heard Andy Burnham speak too.
Yeah. Which A&E department are you in?
I'm in West London.
Okay. which, do you mind if I ask which trust?
I'd rather not say.
Okay, fine. I think the first thing to say is during the past Labour government, so this is where I kind of put my politician hat on, and generally start by saying these are the lines, which I'm happy to give to you, and that's great, but and I will do so, but then this is also a rare opportunity for me to be completely honest and frank about things, of saying this is what I think is not going well. For the period of time that the Labour government was in power, we saw waiting lists reduced, we saw a huge increase in infrastructure into the National Health Service. There were structural changes around foundation hospitals that are now being, and PFI, which are now being fully identified, and there are tweaks. But since the Health and Social Care Act of 2012, from the current Conservative government, we have seen a year-on-year, in fact month-on-month, decrease in expenditure and also an increase, it's almost an exact inverse line, of increasing of waiting times. The worst that I did an actual residential survey in my own constituency. We knocked on doors and asked people, look, how long does it take you to see a doctor? Is it usually less than 48? And mind you, the pledge is to be less than 48 hours. And everybody's like, yeah, mostly, sure, I should be able to see them. It's like, really? And they're like, oh, you mean an emergency appointment, right? It's like, no, just calling up a doctor and saying, I'd like to see you. People don't do that. People in most GPs call their doctors up because they want to see them, they call at 8:30 to get the emergency appointment, even if you don't have an emergency problem. The problem with that is taking it away from people who do need to see their doctors. Another thing that this government has done is remove and drastically reduce walk-in centres as well, which was a great way of alleviating pressures from GPs and also A&E. In terms of what Labour would do, we're promising 20,000 more nurses, 8,000 more GPs, a stop to the cuts of walk-in centres, but also to have more qualified nurses on the, and most people know this, but there's it's the 111 or it's the 150, 111 number, which is kind of what NHS Direct was. So if you are ill or you're at home, you're not certain if you need to go to the doctor or A&E, calling that up, you normally get a receptionist or you get somebody who is essentially a telemarketer. They will have lots of questions for you, and it's a kind of decision tree which says go to hospital or stay at home. What we're proposing actually is to have qualified nurses who can give you the treatment over the phone to take that pressure away from A&E departments, which everyone agrees is just becoming so bad that I heard in I think last week in Birmingham, there were tents outside of A&E departments because people are waiting for so long because the pressure's so bad. And that is largely because of, I would argue, cuts, but I'd also say mismanagement of infrastructure, partially brought on by the Health and Social Care Act. That was a very tricky answer, I apologise.
Hi, this question is more of a, I'm just curious to explore this with either of the panel members. I'm a psychotherapist and I work with clients a lot around their emotional distress. One of my curiosity, and I guess I'm putting that to you because you're working with the community, how has the recent sort of event in Paris, as being the latest and extreme of many, affect the ordinary Muslims on a very sort of ordinary level? How are the people experiencing? I know you as a politician and have a different face and a different level of connection to this, but in your walk about and talk, how do ordinary Muslims experience this in terms of are they able to talk about it, or has it shut down conversation? I'm just curious to put that to yourself and to widen that discussion up, because I've had opportunities where the wider issue, global issue, where people have been very distressed by.
So there's two types. There's me as a person and a person involved in politics, and then me kind of knocking on doors. It's this type, when you talk about it, you see saying, I'm just going to face, they're very happy to see you, they think, what's your dad's name? Maybe I know him, maybe you don't. But it's just a thing, and you go through that conversation, you have a cup of tea. And we talk about things like healthcare and very national issues, and there's a very conscious decision to avoid talking about these things until they say, the things that are going on. It's Palestine is the thing that we start talking about, and foreign policy. And we almost all invariably agree. I think the Labour Party could be stronger on their support for Gaza, frankly, than they should be, and also about their outright their criticism of Israel. And perhaps sometimes they could be more critical. And we talk about that, and then it expands onto it's almost geographic. It goes from Palestine just to a bit to Syria, and then goes to Pakistan or India. And there's a sense of, and you can see their shoulders slump, and it's a despondence of a combination of being overwhelmed and lost. And that's the kind of the politics part of me. The personal part of me, and I've noticed this more and more, and I've become a bit concerned, is I don't have only Muslim friends, I have lots of non-Muslim friends, and we discuss these kind of things and their own politics. And frankly, since Charlie Hebdo, everybody who I used to talk to is saying, you know, the Daily Mail's and saying, just pay no attention to them, Fox News are crazy, don't worry, we understand. They'll say those things now, but then they'll say, but you know, like it has happened a few times, like, and then they become curious and pseudo kind of want to ask. And for me, there's a really disappointing moment there, because I feel like the war of communication has been lost, and the war of hearts and minds is being lost. That normal, sensible, liberal, everyday people who would, in a moment, just kind of write this off, are now saying, well, you know, they do have a point. We have seen lots of these attacks, and why can't a person draw a cartoon of a man who lived 1,500 years ago? And it's that, no, you're going down this wrong path. You're allowing them to create the debate for you. They're separate issues. And it's the fact that I'm having to do that to reasoned, pretty liberal-minded people of a young age starts to concern me. And it's a combination of feeling a bit lost, but also isolated. But what's interesting is, from a mental health perspective, I think wider ethnic minority communities don't deal with mental health problems at all. They also don't attach physical health to mental health either. I think there's been loads of studies recently, and I was reading up on one of them, which is to say, if you're a long-term mental health sufferer and you're from an ethnic minority, say from 35, you are 60% more likely to have heart disease by the time you're 50. You are 40% more likely to be in long-term unemployment, and you're actually 20% more likely to commit crime. So there's a very direct link between mental health, physical health, and just long-term well-being. But it's something that's never discussed. I think particularly in Pakistani and Asian communities, I can't speak for Arab communities, and I'd be very eager and keen to hear from them. But there's that wider thing of, even around Charlie Hebdo, even if you just talk about mental health, it's just a taboo subject. You don't talk about it. And that's a very difficult dynamic to breach. But what's really interesting is some of the work that you've been doing and some of the videos you've been talking about. I would think it's quite brave for a Somali woman in East London to come out and say, I have a mental health problem on a video. That takes quite a bit of courage and also quite forward thinking. So I'd be very interested to hear more about how it's being approached with you.
Yeah, so yeah, just to sort of broad point on mental health, and I'll go back sort of linking to Charlie Hebdo. Yeah, that project came about because of Muslim communities basically not crossing the threshold, and there's an awful lot of sort of common barriers that we kept coming across, such as I can deal with my problems myself, bring shame on my friend or on my family, Western therapy isn't relevant for me. So it was to try and find a shared language to address these, and certainly not to promote one thing over another, but just to find a space and to find a language where these things could be discussed even. And not even necessarily between a doctor and patient, or maybe it was within communities. So the Somali lady who we worked with, she volunteered to appear in the film, and we asked her if she we could just film her hands, or she's like, no, film me openly. These things have to be talked about and have to be discussed, which is fun. I mean, considering sort of the extent of the stigma, particularly within the Somali community, although it's high across the board. It was really quite a big thing. Just to go back to Charlie Hebdo, sort of, we do a lot of work in schools with sort of secondary, sort of between sort of 12 to 20-year-olds, let's say. And no matter what's happened globally in the news, the kids will be talking about it. They'll be, recounting experiences where something has happened because they've faced the backlash. And we're talking about very, very young children. Similarly, my non-Muslim friends, or sort of my ex-flatmate who's Australian, who's a primary school teacher, didn't know there was such a thing as Hajj, or she didn't know what it was. She works in East London, and that just goes on. And I think so long as there aren't sort of alternative narratives or alternative sources or resources that people can draw on to gain more knowledge or insight into Islam. I mean, we're all sitting here, we know Islam is a huge sort of entity, and for it to be narrowed wrongly also in the media in such a way, but for non-Muslims and Muslims alike to begin a sort of either reacting to that or it becomes that, that's quite dangerous. So I think there definitely need to be alternative spaces, or such as the Somali lady in the film. That's another side or face that would not usually be in the public domain, that can give a more in-depth insight.
Sorry, can I just add to that, if you don't mind, to both of you? I hear that, but I guess I'm also was interested on a global level. You talked about the context, global and the national. So what I'm saying is the global issues are coming very intimate and knocking on the door of people's personal and everyday intimate lives. What happens elsewhere is a very intimate process we have because of the media, and also how our identities, you talk about navigating, is used or positioned. And I guess that's my personal thoughts around that, was that it's an emotional cost to those experiences, not just for the globally, but in particular for the Muslim community. And I guess how much of that is undermined and talked about because we're so busy trying to look at the political issues on a day-to-day level, whether I'm talking on my hat as a clinician or as a personally as a Muslim woman. It's a huge cost on an emotional level. It's a way of fragmenting our sense of belonging, identity, and being part of something. And I think the emotional cost of that, I just wanted to park that to yourselves, because it probably isn't talked about as much, because those little subtlety of the experiences when, I remember, I think years ago when we had our own issues in London, when a Muslim woman's headscarf was grabbed off, and that's the emotional cost of something, as a knock-on effect and what it did to somebody. So I guess I'm just thinking that we need to understand the different processes involved, not just on a media or a political level, but there's also a lot of personal cost to these effects, and we don't really talk about that enough.
Yeah. Saba?
Bilal, I'm just going to follow on from that point. I'm just interested because you just mentioned in the article that your demographic, the people who are concerned about this terrorism kind of aspect are young people, but I wonder if it differs with the demographic. Does it differ with the older generation of your perspective?
So again, everything I kind of talk about is very empirical, right? So it's based on, so we've got some data, but it's me as a politician on the front line knocking on doors and talking to people. I should also mention Chingford and Woodford Green is the north of, well, if you know the A406, the north of it is perhaps one of the more affluent parts of London, and also kind of racially homogenous. It's mostly white. South of it's very diverse, and it's getting even more and more diverse. In terms of the way that people talk about it, not really. I think, and also the older generation that I do come across tend not to talk about it. There's a kind of sudden shrug of the shoulders. It's really great that you're running. Yeah, I'm very happy for you. The younger generation are much more kind of involved in it and have the kind of conversations that we're having and saying, right, this is how I feel. And the emotional point is actually, it's very nuanced, because actually I think everyone feels it, but we never actually articulate that point. There is, and I think that's defined by that shrug of shoulders. But in terms of the elder generation, honestly, sometimes it would be, if you answer the door to an elder gentleman, it would be kind of a variety of, it's a Jewish conspiracy, they're all trying to get us, and it's like, okay, that's a viewpoint, and that's fine. I probably don't agree with all of that, that's fine. Then there'll be a kind of, another one is like, we've seen this before. This was the IRA was the same kind of thing, which is actually quite new, quite interesting. It's like there's a history, a cyclical thing going on. And then there's a third group that kind of dismiss it and don't really want to talk about it. But that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is kind of ethnic minorities don't like talking about taboo subjects. It's almost a shameful thing. So they move on and talk about councils and stuff.
The reason why I asked that is just hearing from what you were saying and what's been going on the last week. It just seems that this issue tends to be kind of everywhere.
Yeah.
But when I have my opinion knocking on my door, it is about local issues.
Yeah.
It is about, these cameras saying, I want to know about, pawn shops that are opening down my high street and stuff like that. I'm just wondering how much of the whole terrorism kind of issue really is an issue for your constituent who's all you're knocking on. I mean, the way I see it is Joe Bloggs cares about his mortgage, cares about his job, cares about his kids' education, and wants to, put food on the table.
He cares about his speed bumps, actually. That's where he really, honestly, you're right, it's his speed bumps, there's too much litter on the pavement,
Yeah.
and they're down number 14 are always smoking weed. Like that's what they really worry about. And then you almost have to bring up conversations like the NHS. The one thing though, so also I think we're pretty kind of politically enlightened group here, and we have these views, otherwise we wouldn't spend our Friday nights talking about them. Kind of Joe Blogs, kind of people on the street, don't necessarily formulate their views, but they certainly have instincts about things. So a conversation you often see is, you know, I've lived here all my life, I've worked really hard, we never took benefits. Sometimes you hear, I've never voted Conservative, that begins to decode of, I'm probably voting UKIP. And then it will be, I'm not racist, but, and they're not actually racist, but they feel that they need to caveat identify. And it starts the conversation of immigration. And then it moves on to this kind of indefinable, the only way to describe it is otherness. There are people here who are not me, different views, look different, have a different faith. And I am uncomfortable about that. And that point can be described in any number of ways. I can't find a job for my kid, my business is going under because of Polish people, I've seen stuff that happens on the news. That otherness debate, that's pretty relevant, and that's pretty frequent.
But do you not think that otherness applies to the Muslim community? Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine.
My friend just made a comment about an article that she read a while ago about Muslims who don't have non-Muslim fragments.
Yeah.
And we blame it on the kind of other kind of communities that they target us. But if you look at kind of inner city hubs, like I'm going to pick on Britain,
Yeah.
and you know, a lot of places are really insular. So does it not? Isn't the responsibility of the
I completely agree. Like you're not going to find me fighting you on that one. There is an incumbency of being more engaged and integrated. There is, however, I think an elder generation they didn't feel welcome, and I think that has itself bled through communities. But it is incumbent upon us to be out there and be saying, actually, we are as credible as you are, we're welcoming as you are, and it's two parts. Because, and I think this goes back to your point earlier on, because if we're not doing that, if we're not positively engaging, we have this vacuum, and it will be filmed by people who don't necessarily dislike us or have xenophobic or racist views, but they are in the dark, and they're unknown, and they're just left with this sense of otherness. And people like Nigel Farage will come in and fill that void. And that's a very unwelcoming scenario to be in.
Actually, if I could just pick up, it seems to me also, isn't there a question of, I mean, we tend to speak about Islamophobia, but isn't there some sort of deeply rooted racism? And the way I see it is, just in the same way that Muslims are always asked to sort of apologise or anything.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen cases of child abuse, Rolf Harris, Jimmy Savile, and everything. You never see people asking white middle-aged
But this is a very
Christian
good
men
point, yeah.
to actually, well, can you say, what is wrong with your culture? What
Yeah.
is wrong with, the Anglo-Saxon Protestant faith that actually seems to encourage child abuse?
Yeah.
So so it seems to be, because obviously the majority of Muslims in this country tend to be from Asian backgrounds.
Yeah.
Obviously it's not a race, we have white Britons who are Muslim, but because they tend to be seen as brown and Asian, it does appear to me as a sort of deeply rooted racism, and we're kind of treading on eggshells and not really talking about it.
So that one's a really interesting point, and that caused, and this is me taking my Muslim hat off and putting on my Asian hat. Not that I think that they're different hats, not that I actually have hats. Sorry, I just had a really weird image at home with a variety of hats that said Muslim on it or something. The difficulty with that one is, and frankly, I didn't think that was about race. I thought that was about misogyny. I thought that was about gender equality, and within communities there's a perfect storm of latent misogyny and taboo issues of sexuality not being discussed, and the kind of what we call in Urdu izzat, right? Respect. You can't talk about this stuff outside of the family home, and also social deprivation, and you put those groups together, and you get this kind of powder keg. And it was the fact that they were Pakistani, but I didn't think that because they were inherently Pakistani, they're more prone to be sexual abusers.
No, obviously.
But exactly that. But it's that, and that's to me explaining to you, yeah, I get that. That's a very hard conversation to have in less than 10 words. And it's an easy narrative to sell it the other way, right? You see a bunch of people who look the same, and it's an easy headline. And that's the difficulty. There is a genuine discussion we need to have about how the media portrays us. And I always get annoyed sometimes. I used to get annoyed about that one because I felt that that's the coward's answer. It's about us putting it forward. But when it's relentless, I mean, when you've got Rupert Murdoch, who is probably the most powerful media mogul on the face of the earth, saying some pretty racist things on Twitter. You've got to start asking yourself, like, am I on an even keel when I'm making this fight? Because, and I've been kind of the guy who's always been like, no, we should put best foot forward. Even I'm looking at it thinking, I'm exhausted by this, and this is getting harder. And I don't necessarily think it's about racism. I think it's about, it's the path to least resistance. It's the easiest answer. It's the lowest common denominator. It's all because of the Muslims. Let's forget that that's a 1500-year-old religion with infinite amounts of philosophy, art and culture and judicial, legal precedents behind it. They're Muslims. It's easier. It's a nice, easy, quick answer. And I think that's a difficulty we will always have.
Do you think the Muslim MPs should be doing more to tackle some of these issues?
So I think all MPs should be doing stuff like this. So there is this thing, and I like what men to do, but the problem we always sometimes have is that because I'm a Muslim doesn't mean I can't speak for every single person in this room to say I know all of you and the Muslim experience that you've had. I know my Islamic experience, and I can kind of relate to what that is, and I can have the big points. The problem is when we start saying Muslim MPs must represent Muslims, we somehow suddenly think that nobody else gets to represent Muslims. And equally, and I think this is just as important, it goes back to the point we made earlier, is just because I'm a Muslim person doesn't suddenly mean I don't care about my taxes. It suddenly doesn't mean I don't care about my healthcare or my kids' education. Like, I kind of care about the fact that my speed bumps, I have speed bumps on my road. Of course I care about other things, but I also want to care about that. There's almost, perhaps we are part of the problem on this in that we always feel we need to talk about Muslim issues. We are entitled to talk about welfare and healthcare and education from a Muslim perspective and a personal perspective. And it's about us being more integrated, being more involved to say, I want to talk about a variety of things. Islam is one of them, and I know a bit about that. And equally for Muslim MPs to say, I can speak about these things, but you know what, I can also talk about trade unions, I can also talk about banking regulations, and I can also talk about fox hunting. So I think there's a two-way street on that one.
Just a quick comment on what we're discussing now. I think, yes, you're right, the media, the way we're portrayed in the media, as all minority groups, I think in particular within the news, they often take the easy way out, and they find the stereotypical voice to come forward, and I think that's, especially considering there's major drives to diversify broadcast and media, I don't see it really happening at all. I think when it comes to programming, your sitcoms, I think there's a bit more of an effort going on there, but when it comes to the news, there's very, very narrow points of view that are portrayed. I think that's a shame.
I'm really sorry, I'm going to disagree with that, because I'm not saying the news or certain media outlets aren't completely biased, but there needs to be impartiality in it. But what you see on the BBC, I'm going to concentrate on the news here and Channel 4, every network has its own remit, but it's no different to what we'll say in Islam Channel. Islam Channel has an agenda too. So where you'll see something that says suicidal bombing on the BBC, you'll hear the word human bomber on Islam Channel. Although I'm picking on Islam Channel, I'm just showing the differentiation between semantics there. So and news is there, it's an analysis, it's there to analyse stuff.
Yeah, and impartially, fair and measured and a balanced voice. A diversity of voices or a diversity of issues. And there's a tendency, in particular within the mainstream broadcast areas, they find the usual voice, the representation of the Muslim voice comes forward, and they normally have the usual suspects coming along time and again. And I think there isn't a balanced, measured voice that they strive to portray. I think, yeah, you're
Okay,
right.
I would suggest that we pick this up after the event. We're going to have 20 minutes at the end, so if you two just pick it up afterwards, I think that would be great. We're going to take the next question.
So I've got a question for Bilal. To go back to the political party thing. So for a long time we've had two main parties in this country, and as you very eloquently explained to us, the Tories seem to have failed a lot of people while they've been in power. Why is it that Labour haven't been able to capitalise on that? Why is it that people are still not sure who they want to vote for? What is it that Labour are not doing?
I think it's a wider point that people are just genuinely disenfranchised with politics and they're just disconnected. And I think that's the first problem. So it's not even just, Labour might have a problem. I think we all have a problem. On a wider point, I think that how frank can I be? I can here, but whether or not this goes anywhere else is a difficulty. I think Ed Miliband's a very good leader, and I think he's a very smart man, and I've met him many times, and I actually respect him, and I think he could lead this country very well. He has, by his own admission, quite publicly said that he has an image problem, and we are coming closer and closer to the American style of politics, of what you look like is as important as what you say. And for better or worse, and I don't always think that this is just because there's a bias, right-wing biased media. He's not the most photogenic man. Like, he's not, and but to his credit, he said that. Like, he's put himself out there. He's not the slickest guy in town. David Cameron is a very slick-looking guy. Like, he presents himself well. He's a PR man. Like, he knows how to portray himself, and that carries itself with importance. And when you're on the doorstep, the conversation is very much, we actually like your policies. We like you. We worried about Ed as a leader, not in terms of because of like how he eats a sandwich, but very much about legitimacy. It goes to that authority point. Is this the guy I want leading my country? And that falls to a perception of Ed rather than who he is as well. And I think the answer that he will be solved by, I think, debates will be a really, really good chance for people to see, you know what, maybe he sounds funny, but he knows what he's talking about. And I'm personally really looking forward to those debates. Because I think they'll actually bring out, and they'll put people under a spotlight for about 45 minutes. So you can't just fill it with endless 10-word answers that look and sound very slick. You will have to think things through and answer them. So I think things will change very much so. And I'd also say, we haven't historically, there hasn't been an opposition in this country that's lasted only one term since like 1928. So if we're in a position that we lose, but we didn't completely lose, it was a coalition, and we're back in within 5 years, historically that's not happened in modern day politics. So, and again, because I'm quite a geek, I know these things, that's actually a huge result. But again, it just feels a bit more muted. I guess because of our generation, the last time Labour won was in 1997. It felt like, rock stars had become prime ministers and stuff. It was this huge, overwhelming majority. And I think we're used to that now, almost. I think that's where we'll be. If he does win, and I hope he does win and we win, it will actually have been a remarkable achievement, but for very techie reasons.
Sorry,
just to give everyone a chance.
I didn't ask a question. I was kind of hijacked. I didn't get around to asking the question.
Okay, so if you can finish your question.
If I may. Yeah. Just a general question around politics and trust. The last election in particular, I think there was about 49 million people in the constituency, and 20 million of those didn't actually turn up to vote. And time and again, people cite trust as being the reason. So for you, as Bilal, one, knocking on people's doors, and two, Bilal in Parliament potentially, because there's two different hats there as well. What would you do personally to win trust within your constituency in both those two areas?
I think the honest answer is, and actually we met Harriet Harman a few days ago, and she said something really telling, is never say something in Parliament you wouldn't say on the doorstep and that you wouldn't be upset about seeing on the front page of The Guardian. And it's a very basic, just be honest with people. So, I've had a very frank, honest answer about a question about, foreign policy in the Labour Party, and been very frank to say, I agree with you, and I actually quit the party. And it's not necessarily the best answer, because I might get in trouble for it, but it's the truth at least. You go back to, I think it's Aristotle, right? You talk about ethos, pathos, and logos. And you trust people because they're honest with you. The difficulty with honesty is you don't always hear the answer you want. And I think we've gone through politics in the past 10 or 15 years. I think politics used to be, these are my values, this is what I stand for, if you believe that, vote for me. I through a variety of things, whether the mass media impact of politics or whatever, it now's, let me listen to you, tell me what matters to you. I happen to agree with that. And actually it's changed, and you may or may not like leaders and they may disagree with you, but at least you knew you stood something. If I were a voting age at the time, I would never vote for Margaret Thatcher. I would have done everything I possibly could in my power to stop her from getting into government. And I still stand by that. But I can see the people who support it to this day. I mean, she's been dead for a few years, and she's not been Prime Minister for over 20 years. And to this day, people still say, you know what, we know what she stood for. like her or love her, people understood what she stood for, and there was a sense of trust. And there's that, we've lost that, I think, where we're so worried, even as politicians, to make sure that we get the least offensive answer out rather than the right answer. And I'm quite game for giving people an honest and offensive answer most of the time. Apart from election day, of course. Yeah.
I have two questions of them. One just on that last point, is that the thing, that's the thing that, well, UKIP are trying to get into. My other main question is about the social media and the rise, come from both of Sarah and Bilal. And that, when I go to my Facebook page, it's full of different people have majority the same view on a number of topics, so Israel, Palestine, or the war on IS or whatever. There's a lot of activity, but I don't see much action as a result of that. There's a lot of talking about the rise of social media in the main media, about the rise of social media. And I'm wondering, do you think there has been an increase in the impact of social media? And if so, how are you using, or how would you use it to further your own cause?
I would say could you just repeat the last part of your question, sorry?
How would you use social media to further your cause?
We do use social media. I think I'm sorry, can you repeat? I was listening and I formed an answer and I've now completely lost it. I'm so sorry.
But it's important to, social media has increased the activity on it, but there's not enough, from what I see, there's not consequential action.
Yeah. I mean, certainly we see amongst sort of young Muslim people who we work with that things like change.org and whatnot, that's sort of definitely on the rise, and that has sort of certainly brought about quite concrete action. Whether or not you agree with it, whatever, but that's definitely happening. I would also say I am personally quite wary of how easy it is to say something on social media and that purports you to be a part of something, for something or against something, and then that sort of tends to deepen and sort of get slightly more entrenched. So again, it's sort of, for us it comes back to, for us very much working practically on the ground and working in education, working in health, working in lots and lots of different areas. This is the action that will sort of preventatively, long-term wise, make quite a significant difference, but very, very slowly and over time. But I think social media is certainly a tool that we use for that. But I'm quite wary about it being very easy to jump on a particular bandwagon and potentially without any sort of facts and information and resources to go to behind it. And then secondly, action in the real world and what that means and what that might look like. So yeah.
I think I completely agree. I think you can't see whether it be so the things that we have in common is about engagement and getting communities involved, whether it's political causes or some incredibly interesting creative programs and also empowerment programs. But it can kind of create a lot more heat than light. Like, especially like the hashtag and retweeting is a perfect example of that. Like, things can be sent around the Twitter sphere, and it's like there's perhaps 3 people in the world who agree with it, but it's catchy, it's fun, and it's in the moment. That kind of takes the thing. From a political perspective, it is a good way to disseminate knowledge, but in no way is it smoking gun. In no way is it from saying, this is my manifesto, this is what my policy is, talking to people on doorsteps, phoning them up. It doesn't. But however, talking about technology, I think change.org is a really good example. Everybody know change.org. So very broadly, it's a website that there will be matters of importance that are coming up, and they say, look, would you like to petition? Say yes or no. Say yes. Once you say yes, you fill in your details. What it does is it automatically sends your local MP a pre-formed letter. So TTIP was a good example of this. The NHS, cutting the NHS a few weeks ago was a really good example. And so as a candidate, you get copied into all these emails. So normally you get, every few weeks, you get something from change.org about something or other. It's about 10 people or whatever. For the NHS, I stopped counting at, I think it was 752 people emailing me about cutting the in. It was the same email over and over again. So me and IDS were sent an email at the same time. So I was like, well, somebody's emailed me, I've got to respond. So I formulated a response and then emailed every single person. And it was exhausting, but it actually taught me, you know what, if I do want to represent these people, I do have to work hard. and I do have to think about good answers, and I do have to stay up late at night giving them a response. Many of them came back and said, we've never had an actual person respond to us. It was kind of weird. They're like, we send this and we don't get responses. So that was quite nice for both them and me. So it does, because of that access to people who have something to say, that's a great tool. The risk about it is it creates more like the need sometimes.
I would also say sort of an extension. I mean, we also work with a lot of people who aren't on social media themselves. It's sort of, you know, the most isolated people, or so. Although they might, for instance, if you know a Somali woman, they might be bearing the brunt of what's happening going on globally in the world. Their voice is much smaller than anybody else who is potentially on social media or who is. Yeah, so I guess it's to find different ways to reach different audiences. Yeah.
I think we've got time for one more question. Sarah?
Definitely kind of stepping away from Muslim kind of what I'm intrigued about, both of you really, is that we have a huge rise in the number of food banks here in London and in the UK.
Yeah, we do.
A lot of people are on lower incomes. CAD continue getting reduced funding, and they really do help a lot of people for various reasons. A lot of people have rent issues nowadays, mortgage issues. They can just about pay to have the roof over their heads. Can't pay the bills, can't afford food, and again, the need for food banks rises. I mean, what do you think the government, whichever government can come in these elections, or as a society we can do, I mean, other than donations and helping out, but how do you think we can combat this and help people who have these issues? And they're very real issues which are becoming more prevalent.
I'll let Bilal answer this mainly. I mean, my sort of perspective is that they're not treating them as separate issues is partly why we are now in this state that we're in. And I think certainly if we treated it as, you know, sort of, yeah, all interconnecting with each other and didn't necessarily have complex solutions as such, but had a range of solutions that tied together, it would be, which, I don't know, I still think we need a lot more of that, and I'm sort of slightly perplexed that there are some good things going on, but it still doesn't seem to be prevalent or across the board. But
I think, yeah, there's a complete lack of holistic approach to this, and it's this is terrible for me to say, but everything you've identified is kind of like the main tenets of why it's going to be in the Labour Party manifesto, and the fact that I'm running against the guy who denies the existence of food banks, and when he did acknowledge them, he said it was because people wanted free food. We have 3 food banks. I guess 3 food banks in his own constituency. He's never visited them once. I've seen them about twice. And it goes to that kind of thing we call squeeze middle or cost of living, which is, and another one that we perhaps don't talk about is another one is childcare. I'm a married man, well, we don't have kids, and I've met a group of, who went to a young toddler group and met the mothers. I was astounded, because I always thought your mortgage was the most expensive outgoing in your household, and it turns out it's not. It's childcare, and linked to that is this idea of gender equality, because if you're a woman, you're on maternity leave for about 2 years, because you'll have 2 kids, you go back to work, you will never reach the same levels of income that you did when you leave. And it's these things, and that's, you know, I was never exposed to that. I can talk to you in great detail about what Labour would do, but frankly, it's on almost every about leaflet and a manifesto. And by the sounds of it, it sounds like you probably want to support us and come out campaigning with me, frankly. So why don't we have a conversation afterwards and get you door knocking? That's the honest answer. Always be closing. Just always be closing.
Thanks a lot, Bilal and Sarah. And I'm just going to add to that discussion around food banks and do a City Circle plug as well. Because we run a food bank with a volunteer group called Children of Adam every Sunday. And so I think anyone that denies food banks or has any doubt over the impact that this can have is to come along any Sunday at Lincoln's Field from 5:30 onwards, and you can see there are 150 people that we distribute hot food, sandwiches, and hot drinks to. And it's not just a case of people getting food; it's a community. They get to meet the same people every Sunday, because a lot of these people are homeless or they're moving from shelter to shelter, so they don't have friends or a community. So this is a community for them when they go and see other people at the food bank. So please come along any Sunday and have a look at this. With that, please join me in thanking our 2 speakers for tonight. As I mentioned, we've got an event next Friday on tackling and rethinking about extremism. So please book your tickets, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you.
Yeah, good, thanks. How are you doing?